Good morning, Shavua Tov, Agotavach. Thanks for tuning in to the Kilat Shari Torah daily review of Maimonides' listing of 613 mitzvot, the Sefer HaMitzvahs for Sunday, November 20th. We're shifting gears now again. We've completed our discussion of Nazarism, and we're going to talk a little bit about the agricultural laws, prohibitions that the Torah ordains as Maimonides explicates them, these having to do with the laws of agriculture, planting, sowing, reaping, and so on. In the main, keep in mind, to do with the land of Israel. It's a conversation that takes place amongst the sages, and it's determined that these agricultural laws reflect the special added degree of kedusha, of sanctity, that Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, possesses. Accordingly, these mitzvot apply only there. So if you're a farmer in Babylon, in Morocco, in Galicia, in southern Ontario, wherever it happens to be, outside of Israel, there's much to be learned from the implications of these laws. However, they are not enforceable in practicality outside the land of Israel. Interesting conversation, by the way, since this happens to be a Shemitah year. We discussed a little bit last week in one of our classes. This happens to be a Shemitah year where the land is supposed to lie fallow. The entire land of Israel is supposed to rest. So it's an interesting question to determine exactly what are the boundaries of the land of Israel, because everything that is today Medinat Yisrael, everything that encompasses the state and its boundaries, its territories, is not necessarily in its entirety considered the biblical land of Israel. So some places like Eilat, just to give one example, may be within the state of Israel, but may not be considered biblical Israel, and therefore subject to the prohibitions of the Shemitah year, of the sabbatical year, at least in theory. Okay, let's talk about what's here. Let me quiet down and let the Rambam speak a little bit. Next, first prohibition spoken about in the agricultural laws, we are forbidden to reap the entire harvest. This prohibition says we are forbidden to reap the whole of the harvest. You have to leave a remnant in the corner of the field for the poor, right? If you think all the way back to when we talked about the positive agricultural laws, we certainly mentioned Peah at the time, the corners, leaving the corners of the field. People think of Peahs as just the curly Peahs that the Chassidim wear, but Peah means a corner, and the mitzvah of Peah applies to leaving the corners of one's field for the poor, the strangers, so that they can gather their sustenance in an honorable fashion. Next mitzvah, number 211 in the list of prohibitions, we're forbidden from gathering ears of corn that fell during the harvest. So when those ears of corn fall, they're being harvested, and some fall on the ground, we are forbidden to gather those up. Those also should be left for those who in need to be able to come gather them. Next prohibition, we're forbidden to gather the entire produce of the vineyard at vintage time. Whenever it's time to harvest the grapes, whether it's the early harvest, the late harvest, I don't know, I've never been a vintner, but I'm sure Rashi would have a thing or two to say about that. When you harvest the grapes, you should not gather in the entirety of the harvest at the time of harvesting. Again, also, you have to leave grape clusters that are not fully grown. You have to leave those for the poor to be able to claim as theirs, so that they can have wine for Kiddush also. And also the prohibition of oilolos, I believe, gathering single fallen grapes during the harvest. Just like we said about corn, when you're gathering up the sheaves and 1 or 2 ears, or 5 or 10 or 20 or 50, I don't know how many ears of corn will fall. Similarly, there are going to be inevitably some grapes that will fall during the harvest. Those also are to be left for the needy to gather. Arguably, one of the most challenging mitzvahs to fulfill. Shikha. What happened? You are forbidden to return back to the field for a forgotten sheaf. Let's read what it says. By this prohibition, we are forbidden to fetch a forgotten sheaf when thou reapest thy harvest in thy field. Thank you, King James and the 1917 JPS translation. And hast forgot a sheaf in the field, thou shalt not go back to fetch it. End of quote. Where are we quoting from? Deuteronomy 24, verse 19. You can look it up. The duty of leaving what is forgotten applies to all produce, whether of the soil or the tree, and juxtaposed to the positive commandment, it shall be for the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow, that you shall leave it. So it's a positive mitzvah to leave it, a negative commandment to return. We should not return and fetch it. Now, how do you fulfill this mitzvah? You can't say, I'm going to forget a sheaf now. I'm going to leave something out there. and then I'll fulfill the mitzvah by leaving it there or not coming back to get it. You can't do that. It has to truly be a forgotten sheaf where you forgot to bring it in, forgot to put it on the tractor and bring it in at harvest time, and then you have to leave it there. So a challenging one that you really can't prepare for. It just has to happen. So interesting food for thought. Please join us again tomorrow for more insight into the agricultural laws of the Torah as brought to you by Rabbi Moses Maimonides. Have a good day and a good week.